Happy Thanksgiving to everyone. I hope it's been a good weekend spent with family and spent with good food, good meals. And that light, in the evening, in the celebration of Thanksgiving, and in kind of being in this time of festivals, I want to take this time this evening looking at Matthew 19. Matthew 19, that's where we're going to be at. And I want to talk about two different feasts. Two feasts that we see back to back in the Gospel of Matthew and in the Gospel of Mark, and lessons that we can learn from them about the people involved, the characteristics that they have, and what these characteristics result in. I want to look at this lesson through two lenses primarily. The first lens would be, what type of community are we building here at West End? When people from the community come into this building and are around and surrounded by Christians that attend here, what is that experience like? And then the second question that I want you to be asking yourself is, which of these two feasts am I most aligned with personally, individually? Where if I had to categorize my actions and the qualities that we're going to bring up, which one would more go in line with me? And in both of those things, where can we improve? Where are things that we are struggling in that we can bring to a different place? And what are things that we can keep excelling in? So I want you to keep those things in mind as we read through this. And so let's read the first of these two feasts. Let's start in chapter 14, verse 1. At that time, Herod the Tetrarch heard of the fame of Jesus, and he said to his servants, "This is John the Baptist. He has been raised from the dead. That is why these miraculous powers are at work in him. For Herod had seized John and bound him and put him in prison for the sake of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, because John had been saying to him, 'It is not lawful for you to have her.' And though he wanted to put him to death, he feared the people, because they held him to be a prophet. But when Herod's birthday came, the daughter of Herodias danced before the company and pleased Herod, so that he promised with an oath to give her whatever she might ask. Prompted by her mother, she said, 'Give me the head of John the Baptist, here on a platter.' And the king was sorry because of his oath. And his guests, he commanded it to be given. He sent and had John beheaded in prison, and his head was brought in on a platter and given to the girl. And she brought it to her mother, and his disciples came and took the body and buried it, and they went and told Jesus." This situation here is very messy, and I think we can all see that initially, but it's probably even more messy than you realize. Here's a map. I like maps. They're pretty cool. Here's a map, and what's going on here is actually fascinating. And I know if you see a map, maybe you're at a headspace where you're like, this is boring. Trust me, it's not. It's like the biggest political drama like you've ever thought of in your life. So, do you remember Herod the Great, the guy who was killing all the babies when Jesus was born? Okay, he shortly dies after Jesus is born. And his land is given to three of his sons. And so you have the three different colors here. You have red, blue, and orange, right? Herod's land is the blue land. This is the son of Herod the Great, the one that's in this story. His land is blue in this map. Okay, Herod went and visited his brother Philip, which is the orange. They went, I don't know, maybe it was a Thanksgiving time. They went and visited, they were sharing. Unfortunately, Herod falls in love with Philip's wife. And they have a plan in this whole thing where Herod's wife, or Philip's wife, Herodias, says to Herod, "If you divorce your first wife, then I'll come and I'll be with you." And so that's exactly what he does. And so, I don't know if I can show it. Nope, that's not working. So what happens here is, you see this region below, the Nabatean kingdom right there? Okay, that's Herod's first wife. Herod's first wife is the princess of that region. And so basically, he creates enemies on both sides of his allies. The orange region and the tan region both now hate Herod because he divorced the princess and he married his brother's wife. And so there's just major conflict and tension on both of those borders. But at the same time, there's also a potential internal conflict happening, because his other brother, the one in red, was so bad at leading that the people started complaining to Rome, and eventually Rome exiled that guy. And so when Rome exiled that guy, they put someone in charge of that region who would eventually be Pilate. That's how you get kind of Jesus' situation. So what Herod is concerned about in this entire situation is I might have one of my neighbors attack me because I divorced his daughter and that wasn't good. And I might have one of my other neighbors attack me because I stole his wife and that's not good. And at the same time, I don't want the same thing to happen that happened to my brother on the other side of me, and I don't want the people to start hating me. And so when John the Baptist is talking and he's saying, hey, this isn't lawful, you shouldn't be taking your brother's wife, he wants to shut that down as quick as possible. He doesn't want to get invaded, and he doesn't want the people to start turmoil and a ruckus and get Rome to come in and wipe him out. And so things are very, very sensitive. And all of it is because Herod only cares about himself. All of that, whether you understood every detail of what I just said or you don't, you understand that's a mess. I don't want anything to do with it. I wouldn't want my life to look like that whatsoever. And it's all because Herod cares about him. And he doesn't think about the actions outside of him. And oftentimes we can find ourselves in certain situations similar to this. To stick with the text and the sin going on here, at least one of them, is he's in this adulterous marriage. And adultery oftentimes works like this, where people get distracted by what's going on in their life, and they stop thinking about things outside of them. And they stop thinking about how this will affect their family, how this will affect their spouse, their reputation, anyone around them, and they only think about them and their own concerns. And so if you're in a place like that, where that's maybe a temptation for you, maybe that's a temptation, like an actual thing going on in your life, think about how that will affect your family. Think about how that will affect your spouse who's loved you and put up with you and gone through hard times with you. Think about those things before making a selfish decision. Or maybe it's something like anger. And we find this maybe something more simple, maybe something that isn't as big of a sin, because that's just how we sometimes categorize those things. And think about what the nature of something like anger is. That I think for some reason, my time, my positioning, my convenience is more important than everyone else's around me. And so when that gets threatened, I'm going to act on that threat, and I'm going to do something about it. Maybe I'm going to start yelling at someone, maybe I'll start driving erratically, or maybe I'll punch something. But that's natured all in the same place, that I, for some reason, think I am the most important and stop considering those outside of me. What I also want you to notice about Herod's situation and the nature of the situation is he doesn't care about God. He doesn't care about what God thinks about this situation. Because that's what John is primarily doing. And I think there's multiple sins involved here, but a primary one is that Herod has taken his brother's wife. This is specifically condemned within the Old Testament as something you should not do. And so when he comes to him, he throws him in prison because he doesn't want to hear it. And it's funny how people kind of interact when they're in rebellion to God. I don't know if funny was the right word to use there, but it's interesting how different people interact. And I think Herodias and Herod both show us two sides of this. Of when people know that they're not in a right relationship with God, when they're doing something very contradictory to what he would want them to do in their life. Maybe that looks something like Herodias, who wants to kill John. She goes out, she has this plan, seems to be behind this whole dancing thing, and it says very explicitly in Mark, she wants to kill John. And so some people act like that, where they know they're in rebellion to God, and they kind of just want to eliminate it completely out of their life. Other people are more like Herod. And maybe you're at a place like Herod, where it's not so obvious. And Herod has kind of mixed emotions about this whole situation, about John in particular. See, he fears the people. That's what it says in this passage here. He wants to kill John. That's again what it says in this passage here. But in Mark 6, it kind of gives us a different view of this. He fears John to be a prophet, as someone actually from God. But what he does is really interesting. He comes and brings John and to hear him. And when he heard him, he was greatly perplexed, but heard him gladly. That's what Mark 6 says in verse 20. And so he's bringing John in, and he's saying, preach to me. Tell me these things to make me feel bad. And I'll hear that gladly. I'll still want to kill you, and I'll still have mixed emotions because that whole map thing, and there's a lot going on right now. But still, I want to hear you out. And so maybe that's where you're at. You know you're not in a right place with God, but for some reason you think it's an antidote that you can come and you can sit in a pew, and maybe someone will stand up here and they'll make you feel bad every now and then. And you think, okay, that's okay. That means I'm right with God. You're just making an illusion for yourself. You're not doing anything. No actions are being taken to change your position at all. This is the nature of the banquet of Herod. And there's certain qualities and there's certain actions that go along with someone that's like this, and with a banquet feast that's like this. And oftentimes, there's different things that are prioritized or pointed out here. I want to point out something that's very clear in the text. It's very clear that Herod is thoughtless with his words, and that he has a lack of wisdom. He has a lack of understanding how things will turn out based off of his actions, and specifically his words. See, he speaks this rash vow. He's not really thinking about how it'll impact anyone. He just says, ask whatever you want. And Mark adds that, even up to half my kingdom, and I'll give it to you. And this leads to a man's death. This leads to a fire. Curtis had a really good sermon. If you haven't heard it, I'd suggest listening back to it, on the dangers of your tongue and how that can produce a lot of dangers within our lives as Christians. See, how we use our tongue and our mindfulness in how we use it is one of the things that's supposed to set us apart as people of God. This is something in our lives that should be noticed. And so when you're talking to your family, do you think about the words and how that they are affecting them? Do you think about the words that you're using? Are you constantly criticizing your spouse and always just poking and jabbing at them, making them feel like whatever they do is not enough? Is your home a place of insults where everyone knows it's a joke, but your kids also are slowly getting torn down in their self-worth? Are you always too quick to speak in disagreements, leading to hurt that could have easily been avoided if you just took some more time to think about the words that you were saying? And I think there's also another side of this with your friends and your coworkers, where do your speech and their speech match? Are you saying the same jokes they're saying? Or when you're upset and they're upset, you guys kind of handle it the same? Or even something deeper, do you complain like they do? And I know that sounds like super simple, and I know that sounds like it's nothing like broad or grand, but if you don't complain like the people around you complain, it will stand out. It's something that will make you stand out and a place where you can shine your light. If you are just someone of thanksgiving and gratitude instead of always complaining about everything that's going wrong in your life, we need to be mindful of our words and how we use them. We need to make sure that we're not like Herod. And because of our thoughtlessness, our words are hurting people. And our words are making a negative impact to people's lives. But I also want you to notice why at the end of the day he goes and he kills John. I want you to notice verse 9. And the king was sorry, but because of his oaths and his guests, he commanded it to be given. So he has this girl come to him and says, I want the head of John the Baptist. And he's put in this pickle here because it's his birthday. And he invited all his friends. And so there's really important people here. There's military leaders, there's noblemen, there's just leading people of Galilee. That's what Mark says. And so in front of all these really important people, Herod's going to have to do something hard. He's going to have to admit that he made a mistake and go back on that. But that's not what Herod does here. He can't admit that he's wrong and that he's made a mistake. Pride's gotten in the way. And we need to make sure, as people of God, that we don't have this type of prideful heart. And we need to understand good leadership is not always about being right. And we need to understand that good leadership is actually saying, I'm wrong, and I made a mistake, and not doubling down on something just to try to dig yourself out of a hole. We need to be the opposite of Herod here. We need to be able to be people that can concede a point in a disagreement and don't have to always be right about every single thing. That shouldn't be people that define us. True weakness is not being able to admit your mistakes. All of these actions that show a heart of a certain type of person, and I think that we can all fall into sometimes. We need to understand what these actions result in. We need to understand how these actions impact the people around us, how these actions impact the community here, what type of people we are, if this is what defines us. If we're self-centered and we're in rebellion to God, we're thoughtless about our actions, we're prideful. This results in a banquet feast where the main meal, the main course, the main entree is literally a head of a person. So you have this beautiful banquet, probably in this beautiful palace, and you have this giant table. And imagine your Thanksgiving meal, or maybe even like more broad, more grand, where you have the whole table filled with all these things, even like that can of cranberry sauce. And you have the whole table filled. And then, someone walks out and they're like, here is the main dish. Boom, someone's head. That's what this results in. It is literally death on a platter. All of these attitudes, all of these actions, it becomes a negative effect of everyone involved. If this is something that defines you, and you're coming and being a part of a community, or you're going out into a place, you're bringing death into that place. You're taking from those people that you're interacting with. And not only are you taking from them, but I want you to notice verse 1 and 2. At that time, Herod, the tetrarch, heard of the fame of Jesus, and he said to his servants, "This is John the Baptist." How do you think this guy's doing? This is kind of like a flashback sequence for Herod here. Imagine the guilt going on inside Herod. I know I shouldn't have killed John, and I know he actually had some really good points, and I know I shouldn't have taken Herodias to be my wife, and I know that I shouldn't have done that to Philip, but I did, and I killed him. That's something I chose to do. And now he's in this place where he's getting eaten alive by his own guilt and by his own regret. And that's what these type of attitudes and actions lead towards. Is these decisions that you've made in your life that not only affect negatively the people around you, but they also eat you alive and bring a net negative to your own life and to your own way of just being able to live and function. But I also want you to notice this generational impact within the text. It's not just Herod, and it's not just Herodias. But Herodias gets her daughter involved here. And so her daughter is being our participant in this whole thing. And in Mark, Herodias asks for the head of John the Baptist. And then her daughter goes to Herod and says she wants the head of John the Baptist at once, and she wants it on a platter. Almost like she added those things on. And you see, something's really not right here. The family of Herod just messed up in general, but something's really not right here. Where I think sometimes, and I'm not a parent, and so I'm not going to act like I am, we don't understand that our actions are affecting the people around us. And if you are a parent, you need to understand your actions are affecting the kids that you have, your children. And that your children aren't dumb, and the children do see what you're doing right, and things that you're failing or maybe lacking in. And they can also see if you're trying to grow in those things. I think that's important to say as well. See, they will model your behavior and what they see in a lot of ways. And if that idea makes you uncomfortable, I think you need to think about your actions. And I'm not saying you have to be perfect as a parent. That's not what I'm trying to say up here. And again, this is not parenting advice. What I'm saying is put this perspective within your own mind. As you're doing things like this, if your actions are self-centered, if you're not really caring about what God thinks, if you're being thoughtless, if you're being prideful, understand it does affect them. And they might model that behavior because they see it out of people that are in their life intimately and that they know probably better than almost anyone else. Keep that in your mind. And I do think that's something that we see here in this story. But there's another feast that's directly after this one. And it's showing a very different way of just being and functioning, of characteristics, and what it results in. And I think there's obvious stuff that's like, these people are nobles, and these people are common people. You know, this is a lavish party, and this is a simple meal by a hillside, and over here you have a palace, and over here, again, a hillside. But I think we need to focus on deeper concepts that are being pointed out here. And so let's read this banquet in verses 13 through 21. Now when Jesus heard this, he withdrew from there in a boat to a desolate place by himself. And when the crowds heard it, they followed him on foot from the towns. When he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion on them and healed their sick. Now when it was evening, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a desolate place, and the day is now over. Send the crowds away into the villages and buy food for themselves." But Jesus said, "They need not go away. You give them something to eat." They said to him, "We only have 5 loaves here and 2 fish." And he said, "Bring them here to me." Then he ordered the crowds to sit down on the grass. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and said a blessing. Then he broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the crowds. And they all ate and were satisfied, and they took up 12 baskets full of broken pieces left over. And those who ate were about 5,000 men, besides women and children. This story just starts out completely different. Instead of being self-centered and all about me and not considering anyone else, instead you get an image of Jesus and his followers, who are the exact opposite. That they're self-sacrificial and they're compassionate towards everyone around them. And so I want to show you kind of what's happening here. And look at my beautiful chart that I made. So you have Jesus and his disciples, and you have kind of 2 reasons presented, both in Matthew and Mark, of why they're going to the other side. And so first in Matthew, here in verse 13, now when Jesus heard this, I don't think that's talking about heard of the death of John the Baptist, but instead heard that Herod was like looking for him and had heard about him, and that was maybe a threat, because if he killed John, he might kill me too. So he goes into a boat across. And at the same time, his 12 apostles have just gotten back from their limited commission, where they went and they were spreading the message of God and the kingdom of God. And so they wanted some time to rest. That's what Mark says. And so they go across this land to the other side. But the people that they were with on the starting side wanted to be around Jesus so much and wanted to hear what he had to say so much that they take off into a run. And by the time they get the boat to the other side, these people have met them on that side. I don't know about you. When I get exhausted, when I'm tired about a full day's work or maybe just a rough night's sleep, and there's a situation like this is challenging. To give to someone when you know it's the last thing you potentially want to do, but you know it's what you should do. And I think this shows us something about our true character, what's actually there in our core. When you're exhausted, how do you treat others? When caring for people is the last thing you want to do you do it anyway? And that's what we see from the character of Jesus and his disciples. Is Jesus didn't say, guys, I need you to go away because Herod's actually coming for my life and I need to worry about this right now, so please just go away. He doesn't say, hey guys, my friends here, they're really exhausted and they're really having a rough day, and so please get away, just disperse. I don't care where you go somewhere else. Instead, what the text says is he had compassion on them. And what this word compassion means, I think, is really interesting. It means like this yearning in your bowels. It's like this feeling that's so deep that like you physically can feel it in your stomach. You know when you just like feel for someone? That's what compassion is. And it's used 12 times in the New Testament. And each of those 12 times is talking about Jesus or God. The only one that's like a little bit of a stretch is like the Good Samaritan, which I still think is talking about the work of Jesus in a lot of ways. But all of them are talking about Jesus or God. This is a defining trait of who he is and how he's presented both in the Gospels and in the Old Testament. He is compassionate. He cares for people deeply. And if this is a defining attribute, a defining trait of God, it should be a defining trait of us as his people. That when we are presented with these situations that we don't want to do, whatever the circumstances may be, but we know we should, we do it anyway. That's who we should be as people of God. And see, when Jesus has this crowd and they're all before him, it's interesting what he does. Because what he does is in direct contrast from what we saw with Herod and his banquet. Where this text says that he goes and he heals the people, and then later on he feeds them, and then in Mark he was teaching them. And so every way, Jesus here and his disciples are adding to these people's lives. They're giving. I'm going to feed you spiritually, I'm going to feed you physically, and I'm going to make you more whole. This is a kingdom, this is a banquet that adds to people's lives. And see, this is the thing about compassion. Because yes, I think the word literally means like the feeling you have inside. But compassion is something that leads to action. It's not just something that we have in our brains, and it's not just something that we have these grand ideas about or this visionary process, but it's something that happens when we move our feet and we move our hands and we actually get involved in the dirty work of people's lives. That's who we should be as people of God. People that are involved in taking action in people's lives because we deeply, deeply care about them. And we want to add to their lives. And we want to make them more whole. But what this is showing more than anything, the work that they're involved in, is giving and distributing this bread. See, I want you to notice how this order goes in verse 19. Then he ordered the crowds to sit down on the grass. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and said a blessing. He broke the loaves and gave them to his disciples, and the disciples gave them to the crowds. What's the disciples' role in this? To feed the crowds. Jesus himself is not the one giving bread to these people. And how LR read for us, John 6 calls Jesus the bread of life. And I think that's what's really getting symbolized here, is Jesus, in this like metaphorical way, is being distributed by his disciples to a crowd of people. This is showing us and shadowing for us what is to come. This is shadowing for us our role in this whole thing. And sometimes sharing Jesus with people, like giving people the bread of life, evangelizing, whatever name you want to call it, can feel like you're trying to feed like 20,000 people, because it's only like 5,000 men, so there's more than that. 20,000 people with 5 loaves and 2 fish. It can feel like that. It can feel like it's a challenge and an impossibility that you don't know how to face. And the thing is, you can't do it by yourself. The thing is, if you try to do it by yourself, you're going to fail. And if you try to fuel it by yourself, you're going to fail. And we need to have a reliance and be empowered by God in this mission that he's called us to do and that he guides us to do. And if we do that, and if we do that properly, we're able to do this. But I also want to point out something else here. There is a role and a function that the people here are given that isn't seen in Herod's feast. That just isn't there at all. See, this is what God desires in his relationship with man. This is what he wants them. He says, I want to give you a purpose. I want to give you something that actually matters that you can do with your life. I want you to be able to give life to people around you and to be a working part in that. I want to be your co-worker, not an equal, but a partner in the work that we are trying to do, and I want to do it together. That's how God views you. That's what God wants in this relationship with you. But so many times we get distracted with Herod's banquet, with the worldliness around us. with our self-centeredness and our selfishness and all of those other actions and attitudes we talked about, when you could be building people up and giving them life? See, the results of a banquet like this, and if you actually do this properly, is abundance. It's literally so much that I gave Jesus all I had, and it really wasn't that much, but what he gave me back was overwhelming. Think about these disciples here, and I don't think it's just the 12. And they go to Jesus and they say, hey, I only have 5 loaves and 2 fish. And Jesus says, that's fine. And then you have 12 baskets coming out, resulting in this. I gave Jesus a little, he gives me back a lot. This is the principle. If you give Jesus your life, if you give Jesus all you have, he's going to give you back so much more. And we need to remember this in the exhaustion of raising kids, in the busyness of college life, in the heat of our careers, that if we make this our pursuit, to distribute the bread of life, it'll be so worth it in the end. Because what we're involved in, and this abundance that we're involved in, of distributing this life to other people, is not just like this meaningless task. You're doing something foundationally important. I want you to notice a series of words here in verse 19. Then he ordered the crowds to sit down on the grass and take the 5 loaves and the 2 fish. And then skipping down a little, then he broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples. And verse 20, and they all ate. Take, gave, ate. There's 2 times we see this in the Bible that are pretty interesting. One of them is in the Gospel of Matthew. And I think these 2 things are very related to each other. And it's when Jesus is instituting the Lord's Supper. Now, as they were eating, Jesus took the bread, and after blessing it, he broke it and gave it to his disciples and said, take, eat, this is my body. And I think these 2 events shadow each other in a lot of ways. Now, this is what this is pointing towards, the work of Jesus. That after Jesus dies on the cross, there's going to be a forgiveness of sins, and there's going to be this life that's able to be distributed and that everyone can be involved in and have a part in. And this life, what it's overcoming, is what we see back in Genesis 3. So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was to be desired to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate. And she also gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate. We see this pattern in both of these occasions. You see this curse that's developed, and this curse that's made from this selfishness, this self-centeredness, from being kind of like Herod's banquet is. And you see this is overcome with this banquet of Jesus and this life that's available for all. That's what you're involved with. You're helping overcome the curse. You're being a worker of Jesus. At the same time, this points to something greater. It points to this heavenly feast that's talked about in Revelation. And in Revelation, it says this, then I heard what seemed to be the voice of a great multitude, like the roar of many waters, and like the sound of mighty peals of thunder, crying out, hallelujah, for the Lord our God, the Almighty, reigns. Let us rejoice and exult and give him the glory. And the marriage of the Lamb has come, and his bride has made herself ready. And the angel said to me, write this, blessed are those who are invited to the marriage supper of the Lamb. And he said to me, these are the true words of God. Has heaven become real to you? One of the ways that you know this is how active you are in sharing Jesus with others. If heaven's really become real to you, it's not just about you anymore. It's about distributing. It's about giving. It's about how am I going to spread this gift that I have. This is a reality that we could all have and that we can share with others. That one day we can be in a union, in a marriage supper with the Lord. That we can all be together with him and sharing a meal, just like the feeding of the 5,000. Obviously a little different. But in a lot of ways very similar. This life-giving meal that instead of lasting an afternoon or a moment, lasts forever. Are you willing to share this? And so I want you to think about those 2 lenses. Those 2 lenses that we talked about in the very beginning. What kind of community are we creating here? And what's been your involvement in creating that community? Is it a community of pride and self-centeredness, of not being thoughtful about our actions, that's actually taking away from everyone involved? Or is it a community of life, of focusing on the people around you, of being self-sacrificial? And what are you doing as you go out from this building, as you're going into the world and interacting with the people around you? What's the type of person that you're being? Which banquet, which kingdom do you belong to? If we can help with any need, if you want to talk about anything, I'd love to after. Whatever your need, please come forward as we stand, as we sing.